When trying to understand the larger topic of immigration and national policy through a spiritual lens, the following Bible passage from the 13th chapter of the book of Romans is often quoted by opponents of immigration reform. Let every person be the subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval, for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. Now, a superficial reading of this would make it seem that all worldly authority is the direct manifestation of God and both infallible and unquestionable. But, as with so many things in the Bible, if you dig a little deeper, you can come to a very different understanding. Reading ahead just slightly in this same chapter, Paul, the author of this letter to the Romans, notes that all other commandments are summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So it would seem that the highest law humankind can follow is the law that Jesus spoke of as recorded in the book of Mark, when he states that the most important commandment for us to follow is to love God with all our heart and with all our mind and strength, and to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. What then of Paul's remarks to obey authority, and that those who are good need not worry of reprisal? Scholars unanimously agree that this letter was written between 55 and 58 CE, in the aftermath of the Jewish community being expelled from Rome in 49 CE, as ordered by Emperor Tiberius in response to the alleged actions of a single Jewish swindler. 5 years later, in 54 CE, the edict was lifted and many people began coming back into Rome to swell the population to an estimated 1 million residents, many of whom were either slaves or non-citizen immigrants from places throughout Imperial Rome. The Jewish population in Rome was estimated to be between 40 to 50,000 residents at the time, and they, as well as the early Christians, were viewed with suspicion by the government, which can be seen in Paul's urging them to essentially go with the flow and not make waves. The state is good, and if they were good, they would have nothing to worry about. Within 8 years of this letter being sent to Rome, Emperor Nero would begin to actively hunt and kill Christians and Jews, leading to full-fledged revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem just 2 years later. Thus, we can see Paul's call to obey was motivated by intuiting the danger his audience was in, and by urging them to yield to the decrees of power, he was providing a survival strategy of sorts for a very at-risk population. Earlier in the book of Acts, we read of Paul himself being questioned by a council of elders regarding his preaching about Jesus, and their declaration that he cease, to which he replied, "Whether it is right in God's sight to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge." And a little later, upon being brought again before the council for refusal to stop, he and his apostles state, "We must obey God rather than any human authority," which earned them a good flogging for their effort, but still they refused to stop doing what they felt was right in God's eyes. Given all this context, the 13th chapter in Romans is a curious passage to center a discussion against immigration around, because its current usage seems to be employed to justify the existence of power rather than as a way to avoid destruction by that very same power, as Paul likely intended. The Bible is filled with passages that describe how power should deal with the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. In Exodus 22, verses 21 through 24, we read of God commanding his people to not mistreat or oppress strangers and to not take advantage of widows or orphans. In Leviticus, God commands the Israelites to treat the stranger as they would the local, and to help the locals as they would a stranger, because they were strangers once themselves. And in Deuteronomy 27, we read that there is a curse upon the person who withholds justice from the alien, the fatherless, or widows. Time and again it is written that the most marginalized and at-risk people need to be cared for, and even Jesus states in Matthew that whatever we do to the least of people, we do unto him. So how did we get to our contemporary rhetoric of deport them all, build the wall, and the like? How have we come so far from a simple command to take care of the least of these to the everyday atrocities that are seen along our southern border, to countless widows, orphans, and strangers yearning to be free? I don't know, but perhaps it's to be found in that misreading of Romans and siding with power rather than remembering the reality that almost all of us owe our presence in this nation to our immigrant ancestors. The statistics of modern immigration are nothing short of startling. In 2013, the Department of Homeland Security estimated that there were approximately 11.4 million unauthorized immigrants living in the U.S., with 59% coming from Mexico. 61% of these people were male between the age of 25 and 44. As a whole, with men making up a total of 53% of these 11.4 million, a staggering 57% of immigrants over the age of 45 are women. In fiscal year 2016, over 59,000 unaccompanied alien children were referred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, waiting for their immigration case to be adjudicated, with 21% coming from Honduras, 40% coming from Guatemala, and only 3% from Mexico. U.S. Border Patrol figures show that over 340,000 immigrants were apprehended along our southern border in 2017, a 44% drop from the previous year's 611,000, but 2017 also saw 412 recorded immigrant deaths, up from 398 just 1 year earlier, though fatalities are likely significantly higher because these only represent those which Border Patrol agents directly encountered. At its most fundamental level, despite everyone seeming to think their ancestors came over on the Mayflower, America is a nation of immigrants. By 1910, our total population was around 76 million people, with a full 13.5 million being foreign-born. 100 years later, with the 2010 census, the population of America was over 309 million, with 40 million citing a place of birth outside our borders. Among these 40 million documented immigrants, the estimated 11 million undocumented residents are nowhere to be found. They exist here, provide their labor, and have risked everything to take part in the grand experiment in democracy that is America. But immigration is paradoxically believed to be a threat to America, despite virtually each one of us owing our legacy to that very thing. The rhetoric against immigration by the descendants of immigrants is so often centered around the notion that their family did things right when they came through Ellis Island. From 1900 to 1914, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people poured through the gates of Ellis Island every day after passing a cursory medical and legal check, where 80% filtered through in only a matter of hours before being granted access to the promise of America. 1921 saw the passage of the Immigrant Quota Act, and in 1924, the National Origins Act became law, both of which established more stringent criteria regarding who would be granted admission to America. And from 1925 until the doors of Ellis Island were closed in 1954, only 2.3 million people would trickle through this once great conduit that almost 40% of contemporary Americans can trace their ancestry to. I often think of this narrative as being similar to one that is often heard from residents who live in resort towns. Everyone wants to be the last one in and wishes they could shut the gate after they got there. But this is never how America has worked. In taking the tired, the hungry, the huddled masses yearning to be free, a great nation was established from the chaff of the world. A nation that has become preeminent in terms of economic might and potential, but our dominance is far from assured in a rapidly shrinking globe and with rising nativist tendencies. If America is going to thrive in this new millennium, it must not forget its humble origin or fall in love with the romantic retelling of its history where everyone did everything the right way. If America is to attract the best minds, the strongest talent, or even people who aren't afraid of a day's labor in exchange for a fair wage and the possibility of a better life, it needs to remember those Old Testament commands to honor and protect the widow, the orphans, and the strangers arriving on our borders, both those who are doing things the way the law prescribes and those of whom who may be answering a different calling than that demanded by power. Perhaps if Paul had known the tragedy that was to befall his audience in Rome, he may have advocated for a different course of action than one of quiet appeasement. But in reminding his readers that their most essential responsibility was to love God, and that by loving their neighbor they were also fulfilling the highest commandment, I don't think he was wrong. Where we go wrong is in reading a passage like which is found in Romans, divorcing it from context, and then using it to justify a devotion to power at the expense of our neighbor, be they widow, orphan, or stranger. Ultimately, we need to look into our own immigrant history and see how the conditions our ancestors left, the famines, the unrest, the marginalization, or whatever may have provided the impetus for their coming to America, as being the same things that continue to motivate people from around the world in their quest for a better life. As Martin Luther King noted in his letter from a Birmingham jail when reflecting on power and the laws it wields to maintain its place of primacy, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. So let us lift up our voices, and may our actions be in accordance to that highest of laws, the commandment to love God and to love our neighbor, whomever they may be, as we love ourselves. And may this nation of immigrants speak truth to power as we answer the call to permanently establish for all who wish to come to this great land that which is enshrined in our very Constitution. The call to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to posterity. Thank you, and so it is.